Next step and next approach is what is called abductive reasoning, abductive approach. You see here is again a bit of a definition because abductive is not used so often. It's a kind of a mixture of inductive and deductive. So you have something you start from, but you see that this is then not completely satisfactorily explaining everything that you have. So you find something in the material and then you mix it up and you enrich it. It's basically allowing you a bit of flexibility. You are not so much bound. You have a set of direction, but you do then the theory development as part of the analysis, and you still need a certain level of open coding. For the next slides, I need to introduce one concept because we will work with the same concept then several times, and I'll try to use this to show you how we apply it in different variants of working with theory and working with literature accordingly. The case that we here turn to is from another project that we did. This is on the mineral supply chain. Why the mineral supply chain? Because it's particularly long. If you look at your smartphone that you have, or even just the device that I have in my hands now, then you would see that you have a quite long supply chain behind there before you reach the final mining site. Yeah? 8, 9, 10 tiers of a supply chain, as we call this, is quite normal. We would have rare earth metals in there. We would have a tiny bit of gold in there actually. We would have coltan. This is an artificial word basically made up of cobalt and tantalum in there. Some things that you have maybe never heard of, but you would quickly end up that at the end, most likely, some of your material might actually come from what is called artisanal mining, very small scale mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And just as a sideline to point to, this artisanal mining was a core point in financing the civil war in Congo. Yeah? So it really has to do not only with the supply chain, but also with the working and living conditions of the people in the ground in the supply chain actually. I need this concept a little because we will do certain things with this concept, therefore I will quickly run over it. We wrote this a couple of years ago to understand how can we do something positive for the sustainability of supply chains. So it's really not so much looking at the critical sites, which I just pointed to with the Congo issues, but it's more like how can we do so? What can we do in the positive side? We start with an orientation box, so you need an orientation to what is called TBL, triple bottom line, and supply chain management. This is the starting point. If the management of the company does not have an idea of wanting to do this, it will not happen. This is this very simple summing up. We then have elements of what we termed then continuity, so working with suppliers in the long run, looking at supplier selection and partner development, so not just running away every time, changing them for every order, but if we want to really improve the sustainability also on the ground for the local workers, then long-term relationships and continuity is an important point. This is more setting up the structure of the supply chain. Why then we get over to the processes. Processes, we have first of collaboration, which is a bit of structure as well as process. We have elements of what is called technological integration and logistical integration. Let me mention a very simple example. If you look at the milk supply chain either in Kenya or in India, then you would see that you have farmers all around the country in remote places, and they have challenges in storing the milk overnight, and therefore we have seen that dairies basically help farmers set up cooling centers in villages, quite often also help set up electricity provision to run the cooling center so that the milk is not turning sour and bad overnight. And this is then the technological integration, so you bring the technology there, and then you also need the lorry to bring the milk from the farms, from the local remote villages into the dairy, and this is then the logistical integration. Yeah? And even in a hot environment, even with just a double insulated lorry, you can transport milk over a couple of 100 kilometers without active cooling. Yeah, that's what we actually observed and so in India, just to explain this a little bit. Enhanced communication might then be a bit easier to understand, and joint development could be both processes as well as products which you have. But in this case, quite often it's to set up the process in a way that the cooling center actually is workable, and that the cooling center is set up in a technical way that it can be operated by the local farmers and does not need maintenance all the time. Yeah. What you then try to achieve is on the one hand side the risk management element. So you try to avoid problems, you try to avoid misconduct. You have some monitoring of what's going on in the supply chain on the one hand side. You quite often have standards and certification, the codes of conduct that are bypassed already. And of course, you might also work with pressure groups in looking at how can we avoid that we run into trouble there, or on the positive side, what issues are brought up by pressure groups. So what elements do we have to turn to and how do we work with them? Yeah. On the productivity side, we can just continue into the stakeholder management, which relates to the pressure group issues. We have then the learning element, innovation, and quite often also with the use of life cycle assessment, looking at the environmental conditions that we have and the environmental issues, which I rather, let's say, downplay a little here and rather shortcut. Now, what we observed in the literature on the mineral supply chain is that one box, and this is what you see here, now added to the figure, that the government interventions, the kind of how do we regulate minerals, that was not present in the framework, but it played an important role inside the body of literature, and therefore we added this. So the framework itself is the deductive part, the government interventions is the inductive part, and therefore we get an abductive reasoning where we combine an inductive and a deductive part of the framing. You see here direct regulation. This is basically you specify a law and then the law has to be obeyed. Interactive regulation, we can set up standards and we can try to do what we have. We can have issues of self-regulation, or last but not least, the government can also be an active customer. If the government buys more organic food, then it might lead to more organic food being produced. It's not a minerals example, but the same would hold also for buying certain minerals and certain electronic products accordingly. So we enriched the deductive concept by an inductive element. And as we find it not sufficient yet in the analysis, let me briefly explain what we then typically do. We code against all of these constructs as well as single measures, single items. So the construct is here government intervention, and then the items are direct regulation, interactive regulation, and so on. And once you have all of this in your coding table, you can already look at the frequencies. How often does something occur? Just looking at the frequencies is a bit insufficient, and therefore we typically do what you can read about in a statistics textbook, and this is contingency analysis. Let me show you the next slide, and I'll explain this at this example, and I'll use the same technique later on, and we'll go over it again a bit, and then hopefully it should be clear. So you see I added here the analysis is based on 67 papers, and then we basically look at how do now certain items that we have for the coding relate to each other. You use a statistical software package such as SPSS or R, and then you basically can do so. You calculate the phi value. The phi value is just a modified Cronbach's alpha. So on the statistical side, that should be all doable, and I'm not covering this. And what we basically see here is that we have certain elements. The interesting point is that the stakeholders are there, but they just play a side argument. You see, it's just a sideline box. Then we have typical mining related issues. We have how do we extract and what do we do in extraction? How do we create linkages? So how do we move on in the supply chain? Then we have a rather important element. How do we provide primary supply stability, particular having materials available so that you can actually use them later on in your supply chain is then quite an important point. You see that this is further then leading into government interventions, and from there then we come to the central box of supply chain management related actions. Yeah? Significance, that is also what you would find in a text value in a textbook, is usually given if you have a phi value above 0.3. So you would see that all these values are only on this level, and we try to do this accordingly. I mentioned already, we'll take a look at something like this again, but I'll move on to the next approach.